My name is Detective Daniel Collins, and I have been serving with the Chicago Police Department for 22 years. In over 2 decades of investigating crimes, I have encountered every type of criminal imaginable. But sometimes, you meet someone whose story forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about wealth inequality, medical malpractice, accusations, and what happens when a person dedicated to saving lives has their entire career destroyed by a lie. This is the story that Dr. Alex Monroe told me 13 months ago, sitting in an interrogation room after being arrested for corporate espionage, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. When Dr. Monroe first began speaking, I expected to hear another tale of white-collar crime. Instead, I heard a confession that made me question everything I thought I knew about justice, power, and the medical profession. Dr. Alex Monroe was 41 years old when he committed the crimes. That brought him to my attention. But to understand why Dr. Monroe became a criminal, you have to understand the doctor he once was and how one night in an emergency room changed the entire trajectory of his life. Alex Monroe had wanted to be a doctor since he was 8 years old when his younger sister nearly died from meningitis. He watched the emergency room doctors work tirelessly to save her life and was amazed by their skill, knowledge, and dedication. From that moment, Alex knew that he wanted to spend his life helping people in their darkest hours. Alex worked obsessively hard to achieve his dream. He graduated valedictorian from his high school, earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University, and was accepted to one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country. He specialized in emergency medicine because he was drawn to the fast-paced, high-stakes environment where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Detective Collins, Dr. Monroe said, his voice filled with the passion he had once felt for his profession. I loved emergency medicine. Every shift was different, every case was a puzzle to solve, and every patient I saved reminded me why I had sacrificed so much to become a doctor. After completing his residency, Alex joined the emergency department at Chicago Memorial Hospital, one of the busiest trauma centers in the Midwest. He quickly gained a reputation as one of the most skilled and dedicated physicians in the department. His colleagues respected him, his supervisors praised him, and his patients were grateful for his care. Alex married his medical school sweetheart Jennifer, who was a pediatrician, and they had 2 children, a daughter named Emma and a son named Noah. The family lived in a comfortable house in the suburbs, and while Alex worked long hours in the emergency room, he always made time for his children's school events and family dinners when his schedule allowed. For 12 years, Alex lived what most people would consider a successful and meaningful life. He saved countless lives, treated thousands of patients, and mentored young doctors who were just beginning their careers. He had achieved his childhood dream of becoming an emergency physician and was making a real difference in people's lives every day he went to work. But on a Friday night in October 2019, everything changed in a way that would destroy Alex's career, his marriage, and his entire sense of identity. The patient's name was Tyler Whitmore, a 24-year-old man who was brought to the emergency room after a car accident on the interstate. Tyler had been driving at high speed and lost control of his vehicle, crashing into a guardrail and sustaining multiple injuries, including a severe head trauma and internal bleeding. When the paramedics brought Tyler into the trauma bay, Alex immediately began directing the team of nurses and residents in their efforts to stabilize the patient. Tyler was unconscious, his blood pressure was dangerously low, and he was losing blood faster than they could replace it through IV transfusions. Detective Collins, Alex said, his voice taking on the clinical tone he had once used when discussing medical cases. Tyler's injuries were catastrophic. He had a skull fracture, subdural hematoma, ruptured spleen, and multiple organ damage. We worked for 2 hours trying to save his life, doing everything that medical science and emergency protocols dictated. But despite Alex's best efforts and the work of an entire trauma team, Tyler Whitmore died in the emergency room. His injuries had been too severe, and he had lost too much blood before reaching the hospital. Alex called the time of death, wrote his notes in the medical chart, and prepared to notify Tyler's family of the devastating news. What Alex did not know was that Tyler Whitmore was the only child of Richard Whitmore, one of Chicago's wealthiest and most powerful businessmen. Richard owned a commercial real estate empire worth over $200 million and was known for his aggressive business tactics and his belief that money could solve any problem. When Alex met with Richard and his wife, Patricia, in the family conference room to inform them of Tyler's death, Richard's initial grief quickly transformed into rage. He refused to accept that his son was dead and demanded to know why the doctors had not been able to save him. Alex explained as gently as he could that Tyler's injuries had been too severe, and that even with immediate medical intervention, many trauma patients with similar injuries do not survive. He tried to help Richard and Patricia understand that their son had not suffered, and that everything possible had been done to try to save his life. But Richard Whitmore was not interested in medical explanations or expressions of sympathy. He looked at Alex with cold fury and said words that would echo in Alex's mind for years to come. "My son is dead because you were not good enough to save him," Richard said. "I will make sure that you pay for your incompetence and that you never work as a doctor again." At the time, Alex dismissed Richard's threat as the anger of a grieving father. He had dealt with many distraught family members over his years in emergency medicine and understood that people often lash out when they are processing devastating news. He assumed that Richard would eventually accept his son's death and move on with his life. Alex was wrong. Richard Whitmore was not going to accept his son's death or move on with his life. He was going to use every resource at his disposal to destroy the doctor he blamed for failing to save Tyler. Within days of Tyler's death, Richard hired a team of medical malpractice attorneys to investigate Alex's treatment of his son. The attorneys subpoenaed medical records, interviewed staff members, and consulted with expert witnesses who were willing to second-guess the split-second decisions Alex had made during a chaotic trauma resuscitation. The investigation revealed that Tyler had extremely high levels of cocaine and methamphetamine in his system at the time of the accident. The toxicology report showed that Tyler had been using drugs heavily in the hours before he crashed his car, and that the drug use had likely contributed to both the accident and the severity of his injuries. But Richard Whitmore was not interested in acknowledging his son's drug use or taking any responsibility for the lifestyle choices that had led to Tyler's death. Instead, he used his wealth and connections to suppress the toxicology report and focus the investigation solely on Alex's medical decisions. The malpractice attorneys argued that Alex had made errors in judgment during the trauma resuscitation. They claimed he should have ordered different tests, made different treatment decisions, and consulted with specialists sooner. They brought in medical experts who testified that with perfect decision-making and ideal conditions, Tyler might have had a small chance of survival. Detective Collins, Alex told me the worst part was that they were judging my split-second decisions, made in a chaotic emergency situation with the benefit of hindsight and unlimited time to analyze every choice. They ignored the fact that I had to make life-or-death decisions in seconds with incomplete information, and a patient who was actively dying in front of me. Richard Whitmore did not stop with a medical malpractice lawsuit. He used his connections to the hospital board to demand that Alex be suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. He contacted the Illinois State Medical Board and filed complaints alleging gross negligence and incompetence. He hired a public relations firm to generate negative media coverage painting Alex as a careless doctor whose mistakes had killed a promising young man. The media campaign was devastating. News stories appeared describing Tyler as a successful young businessman with a bright future, who had died because of medical errors. The stories did not mention Tyler's drug use or reckless driving. They focused entirely on Alex and questioned whether he was competent to practice emergency medicine. Alex tried to defend himself, but found that he was powerless against Richard Whitmore's wealth and influence. The hospital administration, which had once praised Alex's work, now treated him as a liability. His colleagues, who had once respected him, began to distance themselves, afraid that association with him would damage their own careers. The Illinois State Medical Board launched a formal investigation into Alex's medical license. The malpractice lawsuit moved forward, with Richard's attorneys deposing every staff member who had been present during Tyler's treatment and searching for any statement that could be used to support their claims of negligence. Alex's life began to unravel in ways that went far beyond his professional troubles. The stress of the investigation and the media coverage put enormous strain on his marriage. Jennifer, who was also a physician, understood the challenges of emergency medicine, but she struggled with the constant negative attention and the impact it was having on their children. Emma and Noah were bullied at school by classmates who had heard their parents discussing the news stories about Dr. Alex Monroe, the doctor who had killed someone through incompetence. The children came home crying, asking their father why people were saying such terrible things about him. Alex tried to explain to his children that sometimes bad things happen even when doctors do everything right, and that Mr. Whitmore was blaming him because he was in pain about losing his son. But Emma and Noah were too young to understand the complexities of medical malpractice litigation, and they only knew that their father was being called a bad doctor on television. The financial strain was also enormous. Alex had to hire his own attorneys to defend against the malpractice lawsuit and the medical board investigation. His malpractice insurance would cover some of the costs, but not all of them. The legal fees quickly consumed the family's savings and forced them to take out loans against their home. Jennifer suggested that they sell the house and move to a different city where they could start over, but Alex refused. He believed that running away would be an admission of guilt, and that he needed to stay and fight to clear his name. But as the months passed, it became increasingly clear that Alex was not going to win this fight. Richard Whitmore had unlimited resources and an obsessive determination to destroy the doctor he blamed for his son's death. Alex had limited savings, a growing pile of legal bills, and a medical board that seemed more interested in avoiding controversy than in defending a physician who had done nothing wrong. The medical board's investigation concluded that while Alex had not technically violated any standards of care, his judgment during Tyler's treatment had been questionable and that he should undergo additional training before resuming clinical practice. This finding was not a formal finding of negligence, but it was damaging enough to effectively end Alex's career. Chicago Memorial Hospital, which was facing its own lawsuit from Richard Whitmore, decided that it was easier to sacrifice one doctor than to continue fighting. They offered Alex a settlement under which he would resign from the hospital and agree not to pursue any claims against them in exchange for a severance package and a neutral reference letter. Alex refused the settlement at first, but his attorneys told him that fighting would likely result in his termination with no severance and a negative reference that would make it impossible for him to find work at any other hospital. Reluctantly, Alex accepted the settlement and resigned from the hospital, where he had worked for 12 years. The malpractice lawsuit eventually settled as well, with the hospital's insurance company paying Richard Whitmore $3 million, and Alex agreeing to a settlement that included language acknowledging errors in judgment without admitting legal liability. Alex's malpractice insurance rates would increase dramatically, making it financially difficult for him to practice medicine even if another hospital was willing to hire him. But no hospital was willing to hire Dr. Alex Monroe. The negative media coverage and the perception that he had been found at fault for a patient's death made him unemployable in emergency medicine. Other specialties would not consider him because his training and experience were in emergency care and because the controversy surrounding his case made him a liability. At age 38, after spending his entire adult life working to become an emergency physician, Alex Monroe found himself unemployed, unemployable, and financially devastated. He had lost his career, his reputation, and his sense of purpose. The man who had dedicated his life to saving others had been destroyed by one powerful man who refused to accept that money could not prevent death. The impact on Alex's personal life was equally devastating. Jennifer filed for divorce, citing the unbearable stress of the past 2 years and her need to protect their children from further harm. She took Emma and Noah and moved to California, where she had family support and where the children could attend schools where no one knew about their father's case. Alex was left alone in a house he could no longer afford, processing the complete destruction of everything he had worked for. He fell into a deep depression, spending his days reviewing the medical records from Tyler's case and trying to identify what he could have done differently to save his patient and prevent the nightmare that had followed. Detective Collins, Alex said during our interview, "I spent 6 months in that dark place, barely eating, barely sleeping, and constantly reliving that night in the trauma bay. I kept thinking about all the patients I had, saved over 12 years, and how none of that mattered because I had failed to save the one patient whose father had the power to destroy me. But gradually, Alex's depression began to transform into something else, anger and a determination to make Richard Whitmore understand what he had done. Alex started researching Richard's business empire and discovered that while Richard presented himself as a legitimate businessman, he had built his fortune through practices that were often unethical and sometimes illegal. Alex learned that Richard's son, Tyler, had been a troubled young man with a serious drug addiction that Richard had enabled and covered up for years. Tyler had been arrested multiple times for drug possession and reckless driving, but Richard had used his money and connections to make the charges disappear. Tyler had been in and out of expensive rehabilitation programs but had never stayed sober for more than a few months. The toxicology report that Richard had tried to suppress showed that Tyler had been using cocaine and methamphetamine heavily on the night of his death. The accident that killed him had been caused by Tyler's reckless, high-speed driving while under the influence of drugs, not by any mechanical failure or road conditions. In other words, Tyler Whitmore had killed himself through his own poor choices and drug use, but Richard had refused to accept this reality and had instead destroyed an innocent doctor's life to avoid confronting the truth about his son's addiction and his own failures as a parent. This realization crystallized something in Alex's mind. He was not going to accept what Richard Whitmore had done to him. He was not going to quietly disappear and let Richard continue, believing that money and power could be used to destroy innocent people without consequences. Alex spent 8 months planning his revenge against Richard Whitmore with the same meticulous attention to detail that he had once applied to treating critically ill patients. He studied Richard's business empire, learning about his real estate holdings, his investment strategies, and his business partners. He researched corporate espionage, techniques, identity theft methods, and financial fraud schemes. Most importantly, Alex created a completely false identity that would allow him to infiltrate Richard's business organization without being recognized as the doctor whose life Richard had destroyed 3 years earlier. Detective Collins, Alex told me, his voice taking on the cold, calculated tone that characterized his transformation. From healer to criminal, I spent months creating my new identity. I changed my appearance, grew a beard, dyed my hair, and wore colored contact lenses. I created false credentials and a fake work history. I became David Marshall, a financial consultant with expertise in commercial real estate investment. Alex's transformation was so complete that even people who had known him as Dr. Alex Monroe would not have recognized him as David Marshall. He had lost weight, changed his entire wardrobe, and adopted different mannerisms and speech patterns. He had studied acting techniques to help him maintain his false identity even under stress. The first phase of Alex's plan was to gain employment at Whitmore Enterprises. He applied for a position as a financial analyst, using his false credentials and fake work history. The application process was rigorous, but Alex had prepared extensively and was able to pass background checks and interviews without raising any suspicions. Richard Whitmore never personally interviewed entry-level employees, so Alex was hired without ever meeting the man who had destroyed his life. He started work at Whitmore Enterprises, earning a modest salary and working in an office tower downtown, analyzing investment opportunities and preparing financial reports. For the first 6 months, Alex focused entirely on being an exemplary employee. He worked long hours, produced excellent analysis, and built relationships with colleagues and supervisors. He wanted to establish himself as a trusted and valuable member of the organization before he began the criminal activities that would ultimately bring down Richard's business empire. Alex told me that working at Whitmore Enterprises and seeing Richard occasionally in the office or at company meetings required extraordinary self-control. He had to maintain his false identity and professional demeanor while being in close proximity to the man who had destroyed his medical career and his family. Detective Collins, Alex said, every time I saw Richard Whitmore walking through the office or heard him speaking at a company meeting, I had to remind myself to stay calm and stick to my plan. I wanted to confront him immediately, but I knew that patience, and careful planning would be more effective than impulsive action. As Alex became more established at Whitmore Enterprises, he began requesting and receiving access to increasingly sensitive financial information. He was promoted to senior analyst and then to associate director of investments, which gave him access to confidential business plans, investment portfolios, and strategic documents. This access was exactly what Alex needed to begin the next phase of his revenge plan. He started by identifying vulnerabilities in Richard's business empire, discovering that while Whitmore Enterprises appeared successful, on the surface it was actually overextended with massive debts and risky investments that could collapse if key deals fell through. Alex began systematically sabotaging Richard's business deals. He would alter financial projections to make bad investments appear profitable and good investments appear risky. He would delay critical reports until after important deadlines had passed. He would feed false information to Richard's business partners, causing them to lose confidence in deals they had been planning to pursue. The sabotage was subtle and difficult to trace. Each individual incident appeared to be a minor mistake or unfortunate timing rather than deliberate sabotage. But cumulatively, these small acts of sabotage began to have a significant impact on Whitmore Enterprises' financial performance. Major deals fell through as partners backed out at the last minute. Investments that had been projected to be profitable instead lost money. Properties that should have sold quickly sat on the market for months. Richard's business empire, which had seemed invincible, began to show cracks in its foundation. But Alex was not satisfied with just causing financial problems for Richard's business. He wanted to destroy Richard's personal life and reputation, just as Richard had destroyed his medical career and marriage. Alex's research into Richard's background had revealed that Richard had built his fortune partly through legitimate business dealings, but also through practices that crossed ethical and legal boundaries. Richard had bribed city officials to obtain favorable zoning decisions, had engaged in tax evasion schemes, and had used shell companies to hide assets from his wife during their divorce proceedings. Alex gathered comprehensive documentation of all of Richard's illegal activities, creating a detailed file that could be used to destroy Richard's reputation and potentially send him to prison. But instead of immediately reporting this information to authorities, Alex decided to use it as leverage to infiltrate Richard's inner circle and cause even more damage. Alex used his knowledge of Richard's crimes to create a situation where he could present himself as someone who could help Richard hide evidence of his illegal activities. He approached Richard directly, offering to create sophisticated financial structures that would make it impossible for investigators to trace Richard's money laundering and tax evasion schemes. Richard, who was starting to feel pressure from the business failures that Alex had been orchestrating, was desperate for help. He met with David Marshall and was impressed by the young financial consultant's knowledge of complex financial schemes and apparent willingness to engage in illegal activity. Over the following months, Alex became one of Richard's most trusted advisors. He attended private meetings where Richard discussed his illegal business practices and gained access to information about offshore accounts, shell companies, and bribery schemes. All of this information Alex carefully documented and preserved as evidence for the eventual destruction of Richard's empire. But Alex's most devastating act of revenge came when he discovered something about Richard's personal life that would provide the perfect opportunity for psychological torture. Richard had remarried 2 years after his first wife's death, and his new wife, Catherine, was pregnant with their first child together. Alex learned through office gossip that Richard was obsessively protective of this pregnancy because he saw it as a chance to have another son to replace Tyler. Richard had been devastated by Tyler's death, not just because of the loss itself, but because Tyler had been his only child and his heir apparent to the Whitmore business empire. Alex realized that he could use Richard's obsessive focus on this pregnancy to inflict maximum psychological pain. He began spreading anonymous rumors suggesting that Catherine was having an affair and that the baby might not be Richard's biological child. The rumors were completely false, but Alex crafted them carefully, planting seeds of doubt through fake text, messages, doctored photographs, and anonymous tips that appeared to come from concerned employees. The rumors were designed to prey on Richard's insecurities and his paranoia about being betrayed. Richard became increasingly suspicious of Catherine, demanding paternity tests and hiring private investigators to follow her. The accusations and constant suspicion destroyed their marriage, creating exactly the kind of personal devastation that Richard had inflicted on Alex when he destroyed his medical career and marriage. Detective Collins Alex said with evident satisfaction, "I wanted Richard to experience what it felt like to have your family torn apart by lies and accusations. I wanted him to feel the same powerlessness and betrayal that I had felt when he destroyed my life." But Alex's campaign of revenge extended beyond just Richard's business and personal life. He also targeted the people who had enabled Richard's destruction of Alex's medical career, including the medical malpractice attorneys who had pursued the baseless lawsuit, and the hospital administrators who had sacrificed Alex to avoid controversy. Alex used his access to Richard's confidential information to discover that Richard had paid substantial bribes to medical expert witnesses to provide testimony supporting the malpractice claims. This information was highly valuable and potentially criminal, as it demonstrated witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Alex anonymously provided this information to law enforcement, triggering an investigation into the medical malpractice case that had destroyed his career. The investigation revealed widespread corruption in how Richard had manipulated the legal system to destroy Alex's reputation. Several attorneys were disbarred, expert witnesses lost their credentials, and the settlement that Alex had been forced to accept was overturned. Alex was vindicated in the eyes of the medical community, but by that point his career was already destroyed, and he was too deep into his criminal activities to return to practicing medicine. The final phase of Alex's revenge involved the complete financial destruction of Whitmore Enterprises. Alex had spent over 2 years infiltrating Richard's organization and gathering evidence of his crimes. Now he was ready to use that evidence to bring down the entire empire. Alex created a comprehensive dossier documenting all of Richard's illegal business practices, including tax evasion, money laundering, bribery of public officials, and fraud. The dossier included bank records, email communications recorded, conversations, and testimony from witnesses who were willing to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Alex anonymously provided this dossier to the FBI, the IRS, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and multiple other law enforcement agencies. The resulting investigations were massive and comprehensive, involving dozens of agents and forensic accountants who spent months untangling Richard's complex web of illegal financial schemes. Richard Whitmore was arrested on multiple federal charges, including money laundering, tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy. His business empire was dismantled as properties were seized. Bank accounts were frozen and business partners were indicted on related charges. But Alex was not satisfied with just destroying Richard's business. He wanted Richard to know exactly who had orchestrated his downfall and why. Alex arranged a meeting with Richard at the Federal Detention Center, where Richard was being held pending trial. He signed in using his real name, Dr. Alex Monroe, and waited in the visitation room for Richard to be brought in. When Richard entered the visitation room and saw Alex sitting across from him, his confusion was evident. He did not recognize the man sitting in front of him and could not understand why someone named Dr. Alex Monroe would want to visit him. Detective Collins Alex said this was the moment I had been planning for since I lost everything. I was finally going to make Richard understand what he had done to me and what I had done to him in return. Alex began speaking in his normal voice, dropping the persona of David Marshall that he had maintained for over 2 years. He explained to Richard that he was the emergency room doctor who had treated Tyler on the night of his death and whose life Richard had systematically destroyed. Through false accusations and abuse of power, Richard's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this. Information, confusion, recognition, horror, and finally rage as he understood that the trusted financial advisor who had infiltrated his organization was actually the doctor he had blamed for his son's death. "You," Alex said quietly, "destroyed my career, my marriage, my reputation, and my ability to practice the profession I loved. You used your wealth and power to ruin an innocent man's life because you could not accept that your son killed himself through his own drug use and reckless behavior." Alex then proceeded to explain in detail how he had infiltrated Whitmore. Enterprises sabotaged Richards. Business deals gathered evidence of his crimes and orchestrated the complete destruction of everything Richard had built over decades. I became David Marshall, Alex said, and I spent 2 years systematically destroying everything you cared about, just like you destroyed everything I cared about. Your business is gone, your reputation is ruined, your marriage is destroyed, and you are going to spend the rest of your life in federal prison. Richard tried to respond with threats and accusations, but Alex cut him off. The difference between us, Alex said, is that I destroyed you using the truth about your crimes while you destroyed me using lies about my medical care. You are going to prison because you deserve it while I lost my career, even though I did nothing wrong. Richard's trial lasted 3 months and resulted in convictions on all charges. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay millions of dollars in restitution and fines. His business empire was completely dismantled and his name became synonymous with corporate corruption and abuse of power. But Alex's revenge did not come without consequences. The FBI investigation into Richard's empire eventually traced the sabotage and evidence gathering back to Alex. While authorities appreciated that Alex had helped expose extensive criminal activity, they could not ignore that he had committed multiple crimes in the process. Alex was arrested and charged with corporate espionage, fraud, identity, theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy. He had broken into computer systems, stolen confidential information, used a false identity to gain employment, and deliberately sabotaged business deals, causing millions of dollars in losses. Detective Collins, Alex said during our final interview, people ask me if I regret what I did to Richard Whitmore. The honest answer is no. He destroyed my life, my career, and my family based on lies while protecting his drug-addicted son from the consequences of his own actions. Richard deserved everything that happened to him. Alex paused, looking at the walls of the interrogation room. But I do regret that I became a criminal in pursuit of revenge. I spent my entire adult life dedicated to healing people and saving lives. I took an oath to do no harm, and I violated that oath when I chose revenge over moving forward with my life. Alex looked at me with eyes that still held both the healer he had been and the criminal he had become. The worst part, Detective Collins, is that even after destroying Richard's empire and seeing him convicted, I do not feel the satisfaction I thought I would feel. Tyler Whitmore is still dead. My medical career is still destroyed. My marriage is still over, and my children still grew up without their father. Revenge did not heal any of those wounds. As our interview concluded, I found myself grappling with questions that have no easy answers. Dr. Alex Monroe had committed serious crimes, including corporate espionage, fraud, and identity theft. By any legal standard, he was a criminal who deserved to be punished for his actions. But Richard Whitmore had also committed serious wrongs when he used his wealth and power to destroy an innocent doctor's career based on false accusations and a refusal to accept responsibility for his own son's drug addiction and reckless behavior. Alex's trial became a media sensation, with public opinion divided between those who saw him as a victim who had been driven to crime by injustice and those who saw him as a vengeful criminal who had taken the law into his own hands. The prosecution argued that Alex's crimes were inexcusable regardless of what had been done to him. They pointed out that he had engaged in systematic criminal behavior over a period of years, causing substantial financial harm to innocent parties who had nothing to do with his conflict with Richard Whitmore. The defense argued that Alex's actions, while criminal, had been motivated by a legitimate grievance against a powerful man who had abused the legal system to destroy an innocent person's career. They requested leniency and noted that Alex had already lost his medical career, his family, and his entire previous life. The jury convicted Alex on multiple counts, and the judge sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison. It was a relatively harsh sentence, but the judge noted that Alex's crimes had been extensive and systematic rather than impulsive acts committed in the heat of emotion. Dr. Alex Monroe sits in federal prison today, serving an 8-year sentence for crimes he committed in pursuit of revenge against the man who destroyed his medical career. He spends his days working in the prison medical unit, providing basic health care to inmates and trying to reclaim some sense of the healer he once was. Richard Whitmore also sits in federal prison, serving 25 years for his corporate crimes. He has lost his wealth, his freedom, and his reputation. His second wife divorced him and took their child to start a new life far away from the scandal. The case of Dr. Alex Monroe and Richard Whitmore serves as a stark reminder of how wealth and power can be abused to destroy innocent lives and how the victims of that abuse can themselves become perpetrators when they seek revenge rather than justice. Sometimes the people we destroy come back to haunt us in ways we never anticipated. And sometimes the price of revenge is losing whatever remained of the person we used to be. If this story affected you, please subscribe to our channel for more true crime confessions. Next week, we will hear from someone whose story will challenge everything you think you know about family secrets. Until then, remember that the lives we destroy today may come back to destroy us tomorrow.